All right, how about I am going to, yeah, thanks so much everyone for doing that and introducing yourselves. It's so great to have you all join us today. Thank you so much for joining us for our fourth conversation as part of our webinar series, Community Conversations on Poverty, Lessons Learned During COVID-19, which is co-hosted by the Division of Social Accountability and the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership. The Division of Social Accountability in the College of Medicine is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis in Saskatoon, and we work in partnership with communities and teach and learn on Treaty 2, 4, 5, 6, and 8, and 10 territories. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We acknowledge Indigenous people as ongoing and current stewards of this land. My name is Erin Wolfson, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. Throughout the fall, we've come together with the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership, or SPRP, to discuss lessons learned during COVID-19, how these intersect with the 12 bold ideas to eliminate poverty, and how to move forward. If you're not familiar with the 12 bold ideas to eliminate poverty, it is a strategy of 12 intersectoral and interconnected ideas that if implemented could have significant impact towards eliminating poverty in Saskatoon. Just like to recognize and acknowledge my co-host for this series, Colleen Christopherson-Cote. Colleen joins us in her role as the coordinator of the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership, and you will hear from Colleen a bit later. Please do use the chat, both to introduce yourself if you haven't done so already, and share questions or comments that come up for you throughout the presentation. We will have lots of time at the end for discussion. So now I'd like to introduce our guest and host for today's conversation about barriers created by the digital divide during COVID-19 community closures and ideas for supporting vulnerable individuals and families access digital information. Amanda Lepage works with the Saskatoon Public Library's Welcoming Initiatives, a team of librarians and social workers that develops programs and services supporting people experiencing barriers in the community. She has held a variety of positions at SPL in her 6 years at the library and has previous experience in education, business management, and entrepreneurship. Amanda is married with two young adult children attending university in Waterloo, Ontario, and Edmonton, Alberta, and is only a few weeks away from completing her master's degree at the University of Alberta. Thank you so much, Amanda, for being here with us today, and pass it over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Erin, for the lovely welcome and for that wonderful treaty acknowledgement. It was quite detailed and I really enjoyed it. I also would like to start by acknowledging that I am presenting from Treaty 6 territory. If you're joining us from a different treaty land in the chat, I welcome you to the presentation from Treaty 6. Together, let's pay respect to the Indigenous ancestors of this place and embrace the opportunity to affirm our collective commitment to reconciliation as we are all treaty people. So I wanted to share a few housekeeping, share a few housekeeping items just off the start. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat. I'd love to see where you're from, see and hear where you're from. I'm a bit new to WebEx, so that's just a disclaimer. I'm a Zoomer, so forgive me if I have some technical difficulties through my presentation. The sources that I'm going to draw from, I will share them in the chat at the end of the presentation. So there's a couple of links that I'll share with you. So if you're wondering what I'm speaking to, I will share them with you. And also I wanted to say, if you've worked on one of the projects that I talk about today, but feel you have information to offer, please wave at me or type a note into the chat. We would love to hear from you if you've been involved with any of the initiatives that I shared today. At the end of the conversation, or at the end of my information that I'm going to share with you today, we will, I guess, engage in conversation. I thought we were doing Zoom today, but WebEx works a little bit differently. So just so you know, we'll be watching the chat, and then we'll share your comments with everyone. After all, this is a conversation, right? So anyway, Erin introduced myself, so I don't think I need to go through that. But just in terms of my position at the library, I am Senior Manager of Welcoming Initiatives. I work with an amazing team of social workers and librarians We develop programs and services for people who face all kinds of barriers, including things like language barriers, disabilities, people experiencing poverty, homelessness, and food insecurity. Really, we work for anyone who could use that little extra bit of support. So it's an amazing honor to have this position and to work with this team. So I'm really excited about that and to be here today. So most recently, I became the co-chair of the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership. So I think I've been working with colleagues for just a few short weeks. I'm still learning what it is to serve this community in this way and getting to know all the folks in this area. So you know, my expertise in that area is still growing. So just, you know, please be patient with me in that area. I'd also like to acknowledge the participants, so colleagues from Saskatoon Public Library, I see some of you in the chat, and community members that I've had the privilege of working with. So I really appreciate you guys creating this opportunity for me to come here today and speak to you. So with that, I'd also like to offer a little bit of a disclaimer that it's true that I'm a senior manager, but I'm the first to admit I don't know everything, as we all, I think, are in that position. I know library work, but I'm relatively new to the work that many of you are doing every day, the frontline work with folks experiencing poverty. So I'm not here necessarily as an expert. I'm here as someone who has worked in partnerships, and I worked alongside teams in the development of initiatives that help people, particularly over the last 7 or 8 months as we've navigated this pandemic in Saskatoon. A lot of the initiatives are around the digital divide. And we've been really working hard to help bridge that divide despite the closures and reduction of services, as well as restrictive safety protocols that we're all experiencing in this pandemic. So with that, let's dive into the information that I brought here to share with you today. So in terms of the digital divide, lots of people throw, you know, it's a term that lots of people throw around, but when I talk about the digital divide today, I'm talking about, I'm using the term that was coined in the mid-1990s to signal disparities and inequalities rising from a different access to digital information and communication technologies. So that basically means for some folks, it's easy to own a device and to access the internet. And for some, it's nearly impossible. So that creates barriers, of course, to accessing other social needs. And the information that I'm sharing with you today comes from a policy brief written by Cheryl Camillo and Justin Longo, who are professors at the Johnston Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. So that's a really important document that if you hadn't had a chance to look at, it's a really good one, which I'll also share at the end of the presentation. So this digital divide, since the beginning of technology, has always existed. But what we saw in the last 7 or 8 months is that the COVID pandemic increased the need for connectivity by forcing all of our essential needs and human connection online. For a while, it was the only way to function. It closed off, at the same time, it closed off access to connectivity. So for folks who didn't own devices or didn't have internet access in their home, the pandemic shut down libraries, schools, workplaces. And Camillo and Longo describe, instead of this being a digital divide now, they call it a tectonic shift that's created a fault line. And we all know what a fault line looks like. It's nearly impossible to get over. So that's where we come in community services, is really to try to support people in accessing what they need to, despite the inequity in digital connection. So what barriers do we see when people are not connected? To prepare this, I went back to the 12 bold ideas. And although I think digital connection touches every one of the 12 bold ideas, I'm just going to talk about a handful of them. Leaving a family digitally disconnected touches on income. So when we experienced the closures, many people transitioned into a work from home environment. And it's pretty hard to work from home without devices or internet connectivity. For some families, they depended on their workplace for their digital connectivity. So when the work from home shift came, most of those folks were unable to do that. Even more challenging was people who were laid off and they needed to look for work without connectivity. So no access to libraries, no access to schools. However, all of our job postings, resume building, application methods were still online, and in many ways even more so. So that's a huge disparity that was created and that many folks are still trying to navigate. Another one of the 12 bold ideas that the digital divide touched on was assets. So assets, of course, are owned items that propel folks forward. Assets can mean computers and devices. So without assets, of course, you can't connect. But even for those people who own other assets, digital disconnectivity can mean that they were separated from the maintenance of those assets. So things like, how do you e-transfer rent payments without a device? How do you navigate your electronic bill payments? Monitoring your bank accounts. Those kinds of things have become very difficult for people who are not connected. Education. So for folks who had kids in school, I don't know if you remember, my son was in grade 12 when he came home in mid-March and said, well, that's it, no more school, guess I'll have to learn online. Now that it was okay for us, we were privileged enough to have a device and internet connectivity for him to be able to do that. But lots of families weren't, and we saw that. And I will speak later today about a couple of the initiatives that really tried to help students remain connected and families remain connected for the purpose of education. But connected students could transition. It was difficult, but they had the opportunity to transition into learning without having to worry about connect with teachers, content, and peers. And schools worked really hard to try to remain connected to those students. They provided equipment, and they made learning modules not mandatory. But if you think about the disconnected students, they lacked opportunity to access even that optional learning, and that created a huge disadvantage for those students. Healthcare was another one of the 12 bold ideas, access to healthcare, that's been impacted by the digital divide. So many doctors are assessing people initially on the phone. If you don't have a phone, it's hard to connect with your doctor that way. Also, COVID results are available online within 24 to 48 hours after your test. If you can't access a computer or the internet, how do you access those test results? It becomes even more difficult. So even access to basic health questions by internet searches or digital literacy, what does this mean for people who aren't connected? So thinking about that. Literacy is an obvious one, both traditional literacy and digital literacy. So thinking about things like school readiness, English language learners, accessing things like ebooks or things like that. Literacy is a huge disconnect when you don't have access to the digital sphere. I think one of the most important ones I see in my work with our social workers at the library is system navigation. So 3 words, Saskatchewan Income Support, right? That application process is online, but if you aren't online, it's like a cycle. If you aren't online, you can't apply for it, but if you need it, do you necessarily have the means to get yourself connected to the internet? It's almost impossible. So that cycle is a dangerous one. You have to rely on other folks to help you apply and other places to get you connected so you can apply for income support. That's a big one. This morning over my coffee, I saw an ad on Facebook about Christmas hampers being delivered in Saskatoon, and I thought, oh, how relevant. All applications for this particular organization, their Christmas hampers, is online. And so folks have to depend on organizations to help them apply online. So this is not a criticism of moving all of those things online, because in many ways we have to. We just have to acknowledge that moving things online creates barriers for people who are not digitally connected. So that's really tricky. So those are just a few of the 12 bold ideas that digital disconnectivity creates for folks who can't get on the internet or own devices. It's also worth a mention that even in families who are connected in some way, minimal connectivity may not be enough. I know families who are juggling one or more people working from home, as well as one or more children learning from home, and trying to compete and negotiate for device time or internet speed or time at the devices makes it very difficult to meet everyone's needs in the household. So I'm not saying that more devices and faster internet can solve the problem, because it won't. But when we're talking about the digital divide and creating barriers and making things more difficult for folks, that is also something that's really important to consider. One of the big things that we saw was mental health impacts of social isolation. So during I don't know about you, but for me, it was really hard to go without my family and friends who weren't in my household bubble. I have a daughter in Ontario, and I would really, really have liked to go visit her. That is not possible right now. So we stayed connected through Zoom and texting and all of those things. For families who don't have that ability to access a device, that's a big hole in their social life. They're missing friends and family. We all stayed connected to people through Snapchat and Facebook and Instagram and Zoom. But for folks who don't have that access, it's very, very difficult. It's surprising. It's not surprising, but one of the things that I was surprised by when I started working at the library was how many people used or relied on the library computers to reach out and stay connected to friends and family through social media. So if you are, I guess, pre-pandemic, if you walk through the library, lots and lots of folks were on their Facebook pages, connecting with friends and family, getting those essential messages across. And when the library closed, that was one of the biggest needs that we heard, is when are you going to open again? And I really need to get in touch with my sister. I need to, reach out to my cousins. I need to get in touch with my mom. And Facebook and social media was the primary way of folks doing that. So that was a huge barrier for them. And the mental health impact of that is massive, immeasurable, I think. So those are just a few of the barriers that we're talking about today. When you take each one on its own, it's one thing, but then you take a family who, all of those things are barriers for them all at the same time through this very difficult, socially isolating global pandemic. I can't imagine the mental health impacts and the social impacts on families facing all of those barriers at the same time. So that's really what we're all working on, trying to bridge, trying to overcome. So I'm just checking the chat here, see if there's any questions or additions to what I've shared. So Colleen, do you want to, do you feel like jumping in and speaking to anything that I've missed so far in terms of the 12 bold steps, or offering anything else?
No, I think you did a wonderful job of recapping some of the core priorities that emerged during COVID. It's interesting, like SPRP is reflecting on the pre-COVID 12 bold ideas and how the interagency response specifically around the vulnerable sector strategy responded, and how other jurisdictions, federal government, provincial government, health authority, city of Saskatoon responded to ensuring that pieces of those ideas were also implemented. And so we knew that a lot of these pressures existed pre-COVID and were then further exacerbated during COVID. And interestingly, we talked about tech mostly under literacy and education pre-COVID. But during the interagency response, we realized how integral and how woven through all of the ideas access to tech is. And I think sometimes in the early stages, we focused predominantly on access to devices. But the more we talked to folks who were made vulnerable by COVID, the more we realized that it was actually data. And so devices and the capital around getting access to devices is the sort of the easiest of the hurdles. But then once people have devices, trying to figure out how to manage the data became the harder piece. And I think Liz from the city is on the call as well. So there's an interesting allocation that the city of Saskatoon committed to around a Wi-Fi pilot. And so that was born out of conversations with the interagency response in the city of Saskatoon, assigning some infrastructure dollars to look at what access to Wi-Fi would look like. And I think moving forward, Saskatoon will be uniquely situated to be able to offer some of those supports to folks.
Sure hope so. Thanks for that, Colleen. I sure hope so that we will be able to do that. That's one of those things I know our team, it went round and round and round again, like how do we get data to people? How do we get wireless to people? And we talked about what if we had a van with wireless and we just opened it up and drove around to the neighborhoods that needed wireless, like your Wi-Fi van is coming to your neighborhood at Tuesday at 4. And we tried all kinds of things to try to balance, access and safety for our employees and for patrons. The tricky part is offering Wi-Fi in a way like that would encourage gathering. And that's one of the things that we really didn't want to do because we didn't know what the health impacts of that would be. But I can say, and this is a great segue into what we did do, and not just what the library did either. I'm a huge library fan, obviously, but it's not just all about like, go library. It's what I'm talking about is the work that came out of the interagency was really critical in this. And it brought together organizations with like goals so that we could really form partnerships to move things forward and to propel people forward and to provide services and the things that people needed. So today, I'll be focusing mostly on the partnerships that I know about and that I was involved in, or that my team or our team at SPL was involved with. There were so many amazing partnerships that came out of the interagency work. And like I said, if I don't mention anything or you'd like to share something, please type it into the chat and we'd be glad to share it with everyone, or, just keep an eye on the chat, because I think that sharing those partnerships and those ideas and those initiatives are so important. One of the first things, you're right, Colleen, that we were looking at, like in the library when we started to gather around conversations about how we can provide service even when we're closed, was we recognized the fact that people depended on us for Wi-Fi. I don't know, I can't even remember off the top of my head how many Wi-Fi access points that we had in 2019, but it was in the tens of thousands. So knowing that we were going to be closed, we were like, okay, how can we get Wi-Fi into the hands of folks? And so one of our very, very first actions was, after we connected with the interagency and identifying that as a need, is we went into our branches. Not I didn't know how to do it, but our facilities and IT guys were amazing, and they took our Wi-Fi points and they moved them as close to our exterior walls as possible, so that people who even had devices, a device is useless without the data, right? So people who had devices could come and hang out on the outside of our libraries and access our Wi-Fi because it was wide open to everyone. That was the best we could do in that particular moment, but it was a need that we heard. And that we recognized after our work with the interagency began. Another one of our very first initiatives that when we came on board was, and I was just looking to see if Andrea was here, was our partnership with Chokecherry Studios. So we connected with Chokecherry Studios through the interagency work, and in particular, I believe it was through the arm of the Vulnerable Youth and Children. And Chokecherry was seeing disconnected youth and the impacts of disconnected youth. And so, again, they were disconnected to their peers, to education, to their creative channels, to social media. And so what we did is we partnered with them and we lent them our Chromebooks, which of course, because we were closed, we weren't using anyway. So we lent them Chromebooks for use in their space, and I can't remember if they lent them outside of their space or not. But our common goals were to support youth in social and community connection, high school completion, so doing those online classes that were a part of them graduating, doing some career planning, and perhaps opening up pathways to post-secondary education for those kids. And so through the use of those Chromebooks, Chokecherry was able to provide online programming to those youth, provide access to creative projects, as well as the extra bonus and maybe even more important needs of supporting job searches, employment applications, looking for housing, and connecting with their peers through social media to keep them engaged with the world. So this was a 3-month pilot project. The assessment is still forthcoming, but we really, this project set the stage and paved the way for other opportunities to hopefully support youth in this partnership and other partnerships through city organizations. So, and I was just looking at Colleen said, if you want more information about Chokecherry, they do amazing work that is co-led and co-founded by vulnerable youth. So Colleen has shared the link in the chat there. On the other end of the spectrum, the arm of the vulnerable elders and residential school survivors and seniors group, they were able to secure a grant from the Saskatoon Community Foundation to purchase 20 iPads that were delivered to seniors in April. So what I want to do here is recognize that access to device and access to data, those are not the only barriers. Digital literacy is also a barrier. So one of the things that we did in that partnership with that group is prepared instruction documents and supported the residential school survivors who received the iPads to kind of walk through the process of getting them set up and to provide ongoing tech help for those iPads. And we saw some really wonderful outcomes with that initiative. So what we heard was that survivors, the folks who were using the iPads really appreciated the social connection because that was one of their biggest hurdles during the pandemic closures, not seeing their grandchildren, not seeing their families, not being able to go for coffee with their friends down the street. So learning how to use Zoom and learning how to use Facebook and share photos and open emails really impacted their mental health in a positive way, as well as the added bonus of digging into that digital literacy piece. One of the interesting things that happened that we heard was using the iPads, using the technology, created opportunities for the seniors to work alongside and connect with the children and youth who live in their homes in a way they had never done before without technology. So having that elder youth kind of mentorship relationship really fed their mental health, which was an amazing thing to see. So we have the youth, the vulnerable youth being connected through Chokecherry. We have the vulnerable seniors and elders connected through this wonderful iPad grant that was available to them. That was awesome. One of the things that actually did not arise through the interagency work, it actually came pre-COVID, but I thought it was worth a mention. We had started talking to Saskatoon Public Schools earlier in the school year about partnering to connect families who were not digitally connected. So the schools wanted to engage families digitally because so many of the parent letters and the class forums, Google Docs, all of those kinds of things that are offered in school or required in school, the communication goes through digital channels. And so families who aren't connected don't have that benefit. So in January, actually, which was pre-COVID times, we lent out, I believe it was 22 Wi-Fi hotspots to families. It was a pilot that was run out of Mount Royal High School, and facilitated by the school division. So the school division provided the family, the student, and a Chromebook device, and the library provided the Wi-Fi hotspot to connect that device from home to the internet, as well as tech support, orientation, a library card, digital resources, and all of those kinds of things. So, we wanted to support, of course, engagement with educators in classes, social and digital connectivity to peers, as well as providing opportunities for the whole family to engage with online resources for things like career planning, learning, employment. So just because the student, was working on an assignment, and then dad could maybe look for a better job and mom could look for some training, we wanted to open it up as an opportunity for the whole family. So that was January, and then the pandemic hit and school closed down. And when we realized that, it became even more crucial for those families to hold on to those technology packages to keep them connected. So actually, most of those technology packages are still in the hands of students. So we're just wrapping up the assessment and trying to get those technology packages back, and to see how we can to see the outcomes that we've seen through this program, and what it might look like in the future. So, so that was one of the neat things that happened. It was kind of timely, but it was great. So those were some of the actions or initiatives that I did see. Like I said, if you have any more through your interagency work that address the digital divide, please jump in on the chat or share. I also wanted to share with you a couple of projects that we are currently working on that we're very excited about. And these actually emerged from our interaction with the interagency, but in a different way, because it was our work with the interagency that identified the need, and that gave us the connections and conversations that allowed us to develop these ideas or to move forward with these ideas. So I guess it would have been in June, we put in for the Emergency Community Response Fund grants for vulnerable people, offered through the United Way and funded by the federal government. And we were successful in several of those grants at the library. And we have two projects that I wanted to highlight for you today. We are very close to finishing up our preparation for Wi-Fi hotspot lending. So what we wanted to do is reach a broader audience. Now, we've tried this, we've piloted this in many different ways over the last 2 or 3 years. And we're really, we've seen some really significant barriers, I guess, would be the best way to put it, as far as the sustainability of lending Wi-Fi hotspots. But we're really committed to try to troubleshoot this until we get it right, because we really think it's a valuable thing for us to do. So with the ECRF grant that we received, we purchased devices and connectivity. And what we are going to do is we are going to reach out to organizations to see if they want to refer families to us to borrow these Wi-Fi hotspots for a little bit more of an extended period of time, to help keep them connected so that they can access things like employment or online learning, education pieces, things like that. So that program is very close to launch. So if you're an organization who would be interested, please feel free to email me. I will also put your email, my email, in the chat later, because that's, I think, really exciting for us. Now, those devices are limited because those grants, when we're talking data, it's really expensive. That money doesn't go far, but that's one of the things we got really excited about. The other project that really gets me excited is our shelter device deposit lending service. This is something brand new that we developed an idea for, and we are probably a couple of weeks away from launching a pilot. We received funding from the ECRF to purchase 65 Chromebooks. And what we have done is we're breaking those up into 5 Chromebook groups, and we are offering temporary and emergency shelters a service of borrowing sets of 5 laptops, which in turn they can lend to residents for use in their shelters. So we see a lot of folks come in who are living in shelters, come into the library to use the computers. And of course, those numbers are limited right now under COVID restrictions. Our big idea is, what if we could bring the library to them right where they live? And that's what this program is about. So we will support it by programming and tech help and digital resources. Basically, it's a suitcase with 5 laptops. They can connect to the shelter Wi-Fi. Hopefully the shelter has Wi-Fi. And then they can borrow that set of laptops for 3 months. And then those folks can, folks who stay there can, like, you know, borrow it for 3 hours while they do a resume, or, you know, they can watch YouTube. They can do what they need to do on there to remain connected. And hopefully that will bridge that divide a little bit for folks who are living in shelters. So that's one of the things that's one of the needs that we heard during our work with the interagency. And if it hadn't been for that work, I don't think that we would have been as aware of that need as we are now. So so those are some of the just highlighted projects that we've seen that really could help, I guess, bridge the digital divide for folks in the city. There are tons more. I heard about a lot. I know Dave Shanks was working on some initiatives for youth, and the Vulnerable Youth and Children Arm, which is the group that I was most in contact with. There were other folks there who were working on some things to help connect youth, and I'm sure the same work was happening in some of the other groups. Chantel says, where I work at Riverbend ICM, in the core community, they got refurbished computers through Saskatoon Pioneers, and we have them available to the community during office hours. Hooray for education and employment supports. I agree. Education and employment supports are key to helping folks become more independent too. Amanda shared, sorry, not a question, but a comment. I found technology especially important during COVID for connecting youth with mental health and addiction support. Absolutely. We had youth using tablets to connect to doctors, counselors, psychiatrists, AA and NA groups, etc. Yeah, all of those services forced online, and folks who are not connected can't access them. So it's amazing to see some of these initiatives that connect people. Kali, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to go back to a comment that kind of got buried a little bit. It was more about public library, and I think maybe we could stop and sort of step slightly to the side of tech and just talk a little bit about the role of public library supporting vulnerable populations. Without a doubt, even from research like the point-in-time homelessness count, how pivotal public library access is to particularly vulnerable people, but generally across the spectrum of affluence and privilege and vulnerability. The public library is in people's sort of scope of service that they use. And there are other things during COVID that the public library offers that became particularly problematic when those doors were closed. And so things like charging stations, so they may very well have data and a device, but don't have a capacity anywhere to charge their devices. And so public library offers like charging space and those kind of things, but also the human connection to be able to navigate these things. So it's one thing to give someone a device and a data and say, now navigate income assistance and figure out how to get access to those services. And so the role that social workers play and support staff play. And then also, I'm on a bit of a soapbox these days around access to public washrooms. And so public library is one of the only public washrooms that is fairly, there's no limitations to the use of them. And so when we were in the height of what I'm calling phase 1 COVID, which is sort of March to June, we went about 120-ish days in this community with zero access to public washrooms before we started getting really like adamant that the city of Saskatoon opened theirs. And then slowly as reopen happened, people's public washrooms opened, but 120 days without public washrooms, right? And so there's all these pieces that public library plays. And so to Anne's comment earlier in the chatter, like, yeah, we're in a municipal election, and I don't want to put you on the spot because I know that there's pieces around what you can and can't say during election period. But I mean, the idea that there's a conversation going on in the community about how important public library is, and particularly public library in the downtown core, providing access to services and support to folks that are often made the most marginalized or the most vulnerable for a variety of different reasons. And so, yes, public library plays this critical piece around access to tech, but it also has this fundamental human service piece that's tied to that as well. So I just thought maybe we could just spend a couple minutes about that.
Sure. Thanks for speaking. Thanks for being in our corner, Coffee. I know we've had these conversations over coffee before, but you know, I feel sometimes, like I said, I'm a big fan of the libraries and very passionate about the work we do. And I know there are folks who work at the library who are watching this right now. Hey guys. But I don't know how much I can get into like the election. I'm going to stay clear of the election piece because we are an arm of the city and it is a civic election time. But what I can share is that when our closure happened, and I saw it from our circulation associates, are the folks who actually shelve the books, that's their job, to the people on the front lines, librarians, library service associates, to managers, to our CEO. When we closed, the first feeling was like, okay, so we're going to keep our employees safe, that's our number, that's one of our priorities. But our very first priority when thinking about providing service to the public was vulnerable folks are our first priority. And so our direction from our CEO was we need to put those guys first because we are what they've got, which is one of the reasons why we dug into the interagency work right away. So, and there were a few initiatives that came out of there. And in particular, I mean, all of the work units dug in and participated. But my work unit was involved in a lot of those things that happened. And everything that we talked about in the first several months when we were talking about our plan to reopening and computer access and bathroom access and how will we get back into our spaces was talked about through the lens of, does this serve vulnerable people in our community? And how does this support vulnerable people in our community? And if it got to, well, it's not really for vulnerable folks, then we kind of put it on the back burner because our first priority was to vulnerable folks because we knew they needed us or we knew that we could help them. So that's kind of where all of our partnership activities came into play. And it was tech and it was Wi-Fi and it was a number of different things. We built activity kits, but if you look at our if you have an opportunity to look at our strategic plan, the SPL strategic plan, and again, I can share a link to that in the chat at the end. It talks very specifically about our service to vulnerable people because we know that's one of our most important functions. So I don't know if that kind of clarifies things, but
yeah, I didn't mean to put you on the spot because I know there are elections when there's essentially a writ, whatever they call it for the municipal election. Yeah, and I mean I feel like I can soapbox about public library because I don't actually work for the city of Saskatoon, and so like knowing what I know about what public library does to support the most vulnerable in our community, that is one of the reasons why it's such a critical piece of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And particularly because it's far reaching, like public library is across the province, right? And so people can use it as a space that's safe and allows sort of access to the things that people need. And so, and you'll get a lot of support from us around rah public library at the risk of going down a rabbit hole about election cycles. I did throw into the chat a little piece about public washroom, and Erin and I have chatted that I think probably we're going to dive a little bit deeper into public washroom. It's been a bit of a piece that I have been also soapboxing on, not just for vulnerable folks. Every single human being needs a washroom, and so the access points for 120 days being cut off for people was highly problematic. The only other thing I had just jotted in my notes when you were talking about the shelter support piece, it's interesting because the other big part of the interagency response was how do people who are precariously housed or homeless actually participate in the public health orders to keep people safe from COVID. So hand washing, masking, social distancing, all those pieces are really extremely almost impossible for that population. And so what we found from isolation hotel, so people who needed to be tested and isolated and were waiting results and then were medically discharged into some kind of housing process, is that the folks that we were actually housing didn't have qualified funding for tech. So we were moving folks into what we thought or was permanent housing with wraparound supports and intensive case management, but there wasn't any funding to support a phone. So they were moving into spaces that had like no phone, not even a landline, like no phone. And so there was this ongoing conversation around how are people safe and secure in their homes when they don't have access to that connectivity piece. And so what is the responsibility and policy to ensure that access to technology is one of the core foundational pieces or essential services allocated in income assistance?
Colleen, it's like you're reading my notes. I swear, because that my next thing as I wrap up, because it is, we've got about 12 minutes left in this conversation, and I want to have some time for some comments in the chat. But I wanted to go back a little bit to Camilo and Longo, the School of Public Policy, and I would really encourage you to read that document. It is a really important piece on what digital divide is during COVID-19. And what Camilo and Longo do is they call on policymakers to consider three things. Number one, that participation in the online world and connection to digital resources and communication resources like phones should be treated as a core principle of citizenship, because our connection to the digital world is critical to our success and our sustainability, and to recognize that the digital divide is more than technological, it's spatial, temporal, and social dimensions, and that technical solutions can only temporarily bridge the digital divide. It can't permanently close it. So we have to act as a society to permanently close it, which means making opportunities to connect digitally open to everyone, regardless of income, regardless of status, regardless of anything, quite frankly, because as we can see through our conversation today, the challenges of digital connection is that in the way it is currently, is like even our initiatives at the library and other organizations, it's not sustainable. Those initiatives aren't going to support everyone in the way they need to be supported because there's not enough to go around to all who need. Data is expensive, and I know a lot of organizations have been unsuccessful in securing sustainable partnership with data providers. There's been no headway made in facilitating service discounts or service sponsorships. And at the end of the day, devices have value, and therefore these initiatives, although they're wonderful and great, there is a high, at least in our experience, there's a high rate of loss for those devices. And unfortunately, our funding has limits. We will do our best we can to keep buying more. And I'm not saying that it's the fault of the people borrowing them, because most of the time it's just situational, whether it's insecure housing or vulnerability in the security of people's belongings because of insecure housing or because of, for whatever factor. It's not their fault. It's just a fact. It's just a cost of doing business, right? But loss combined with the expense of service and limited funding does mean that it's very, very difficult for organizations like mine, organizations like CHEP and White Buffalo, and the interagency to provide sustainable digital connectivity to everyone who needs it. So until policy, that's where the change needs to happen, like at that root. And in the meantime, we can keep, coming up with these creative ideas and do our best to really support folks who really deserve to be connected digitally. So with that, Colleen, I think that I am done sharing what I need to share. So thanks for listening to my thoughts, you guys. I'd like to, open up chat to welcome anyone who's, maybe worked on some initiatives or experienced some of these initiatives firsthand, or has questions or has experiences or has thoughts to join. So Chantal asks, will a recording of today's sessions be made available to registrants? I think so. That sounds like a thumbs up. Awesome. Are there any other questions, or did anybody see any really great initiatives arise in the community over digital connection? Have you seen any families benefit firsthand from support to be digitally connected, or have you seen any families struggle? Of course, anonymously sharing. We wouldn't want to out anybody. I don't know if anybody's typing, so I'm just sitting here. Colleen, do you want to say anything?
No, I think, as we move forward with a lot of the conversations around the 12 bold ideas, pieces of it always stem back to the interconnection to income. And so there's been ongoing conversations in community, particularly tied to interagency, the sort of hotel and sheltering conversation around the impacts of CERB and what people are seeing. And so I would plant the seed with folks who are on the line that if you're interested in getting connected to a conversation that's more focused on income and the role of universal basic income moving forward and the implications of CERB, and how those conversations are further complicated in this province by the fact that we're one of the only provinces that claws back federal benefit of CERB, and we're also one of the provinces that has a fairly big discrepancy between what our provincial income assistance is and what the CERB allocation is. So I really think there's this ongoing conversation around income and the role it plays in exasperating the other 12 bold ideas, and then further exasperating that in a situation around COVID because of the limitations around getting to work and all the extra added costs for folks to be able to access those things. So I would just sort of leave that as sort of the next steps. I know Erin usually pops on near the end to say, hey, if you have any other things that you want to talk about. So I would also say, if you want to co-host one of these conversations with the SPRP about a topic that you're passionate about, that's tied to the work of the 12 bold ideas and may have some COVID implications, then you could reach out to myself or Erin. Erin, do you want to pop back on too?
I just want to also share that I typed in the link to the policy document, or the reference to the policy document. Like I said, if you haven't had a chance to read it, you probably should. It really speaks to COVID and the digital divide very well. And it's Saskatchewan focused, so that's also really important. And I put a link up to the Saskatoon Public Library strategic plan. If you're surprised by what the library does, have a read. And know that the library does its best to meet the needs of the community, whatever those needs might be. And then if you have any thoughts, comments, suggestions, or want to connect with for more information about any of the initiatives I talked about today, particularly our shelter device deposit or our Wi-Fi hotspot lending, my email is in the chat as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amanda, for leading this important discussion today, and just for all the work that you do with the Saskatoon Public Library to support vulnerable populations and people experiencing barriers. It's just wonderful to have you here and for us to learn more. And it was an hour, but I feel like we could have gone even longer. So just thanks so much. And thank you to Colleen, as always, for co-hosting this conversation series and for all the important work that's being done by the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership. And Amanda, as she mentioned, she's just recently joined as one of the co-chairs. So perhaps we might hear from you in a different capacity in the future. Yeah, so thanks for everybody for joining us today, for participating in this discussion. If you want to see past recordings or learn about future sessions, in the chat, I include the links. So please check them out there. And I'll also be posting some of the resources that were shared today to take your learning further on this topic. So do check out the website, and we'll upload that as soon as we have it available. And just to reiterate what Colleen shared, if you have any topic ideas, please get in touch. So you have with Colleen and our email addresses. So yeah, don't hesitate to get in touch. And these conversations are open to everyone to join. So please do share them with your colleagues, students, friends, networks, and everybody. So again, thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you again to Amanda, Colleen, and enjoy the rest of your Friday and take care of yourselves.